For as long as most of us have been alive and growing up in America and other countries around the world, we've heard the constant debate between the quote unquote communists and capitalists. And it seems that you're pretty much expected to pick one side or the other in this debate. So, to recap, the communists believe that big corporations and companies are evil. They're all trying to basically just take advantage of the little guy, work him into an early grave in terrible conditions. And the communists believe that the government needs to basically put a stop to this and be used to regulate the companies and whatnot. The capitalists, on the other hand, are usually the people who are supposedly anti-big government. They're terrified of the government getting too much control, and they believe in the supposed free market, and they think that the government just needs to stay out of the way and let the businesses do what they want. However, there is a third alternative. There are actually many alternatives, but there is a third alternative called distributism, which many people haven't heard of. So back when, around, the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the capitalism slash communism debate was really ramping up in full force, there was kind of a trio of three people that advocated for distributism. Those three people were Pope Leo the 13th, the writer Hilaire Belloc, and Hilaire Belloc's counterpart, G.K. Chesterton. Those three people all advocated for distributism. Okay, so what is distributism? Well, there's an online website that I'd actually recommend you looking up called Practical Distributism. It's run by a professor, and on there he states that distributism is, quote, distributism is not about government redistribution. Distributism, aka localism, advocates the greatest amount of private, locally owned, independent businesses focusing on strong local economies as the foundation of a strong national economy. It also advocates the decentralization of government authority over the current trend of relying on a central government that constantly increases its power. Okay, so Hilaire Belloc wrote a book called The Servile State, in which he mentions distributism. And I haven't read as much of that book as I would like. I'd like to read more. But he said, he kind of brought up the whole debate between the capitalists and the communists, where, the capitalists are always complaining about the big government and the communists are complaining about the big corporations. And each one thinks that their side is right. And Hilaire Belloc said that actually both sides are wrong. He said, the real problem with both capitalism and communism is that it cements the power in the hands of a few people. So Hilaire Belloc points out that as human beings, we need certain items to survive. And he calls the means whereby we acquire these items property. So, for example, if you need to grow some wheat in order to make bread and eat the bread in order to survive, then the land on which you grow the wheat could be defined as being your property in a certain sense. Or let's say if somebody has a ship that they sail off to, a foreign country or some other place to go buy goods from that country, that ship could be considered property. Or if a fisherman has a boat that he uses to go catch fish, that boat could be considered his property. Or, if a blacksmith has a blacksmithing shop and all the tools that he needs to be a blacksmith and he has the skills required to be a blacksmith, that could be considered to be his property. So basically, property is the means of production for the items that human beings need in order to survive. And what Hilaire Belloc notes is that in both capitalism and communism, the means of production, or the property, is situated in the hands of a few people. So in communism, the means of production is situated in the hands of the government, and in capitalism, the means of production is situated in the hands of just a few big business owners. Now, Hilaire Belloc also notes the existence of the proletarians. Now, he notes that many of the capitalists, and I think he actually even might have mentioned America at this point in the book, that I'm not sure about, but he notes that the capitalists often point to the free market and say, well, we're free to do whatever we want under capitalism, where we're not free to do whatever we want under socialism. And Hilaire Belloc says this is actually completely false. Because basically the choice you have in a capitalist society as a proletarian is either you go work for the capitalists, or the the big corporations, the big businessmen, or you starve. That's pretty much it, because they have all the means of production. So you can either go basically be a willing slave to them, a paid slave, or you can go starve. And he makes the note that some people will say, oh, that's not true because, employees, they get paid, whereas slaves aren't paid. And Hiller Billick notes, well, that's partially true, but at the same time, slaves basically worked, and in return for their work, they were giving food, housing, shelter, clothing, etc. And employees today, they work, and they are in turn given housing, food, and shelter. The only difference is that they're actually just given direct money, so it feels like they have a little more direct control over it. And yeah, it's true that they have some things like vacation days and whatnot that slaves might not necessarily always have. But I mean, even if you think about it, in modern day America, we get like maybe 1 to 2 weeks vacation, if that. So yeah, not really that big of a difference when you really start to think about it. But anyway, that was the big difference. So in a distributist society, Hilaire Belloc and the others say that the real solution is either A, everybody needs to own their own means of production, or B, you need to have a co-op where basically every worker owns a share of their own business or the business that they work for. So let's say, for example, someone goes off and starts a tech business somewhere. Usually the tech, billionaire reaps all the rewards. Like think Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and all those guys being worth billions and billions of dollars. What the other people say is, if you're going to go be an employee for that, you need to own a share of that business. So today we have the stock market, and basically whoever has the most money buys up the largest share of the stock. So you can even think, and I try not to comment too much on modern political events, so I'm not going to, or think anything like that, so I'm not going to necessarily cite this as being a good thing or a bad thing, but you can think about Elon Musk buying Twitter. Regardless of whatever your feelings on that were, whether you liked him buying Twitter, you disliked him buying Twitter, the fact of the matter is that he was able to basically casually walk in and just throw, however many billions of dollars on the table and casually acquire one of the most powerful companies in existence. And, you can say, oh, I really like Elon Musk owning Twitter or really dislike Elon Musk owning Twitter, but that's basically one of the quote-unquote problems of capitalism, is that the billionaires and the big business people can basically just buy up all the powerful institutions whenever they want to, and the rest of us have no say in it. That's also a problem when it comes to land. So if you live in America, you will have noticed that over the past, 5 years or so, land prices have skyrocketed to the point where most people who don't already own a house are pretty much never going to be able to own, and never ever going to be able to own one, at least according to the current housing prices. Now, many people are sitting there saying, well, how could this be? How is it that anybody's affording these prices? And what they often don't talk about is the fact that BlackRock and other big corporations are actually buying up a huge chunk of these houses. So billionaires actually own pretty much more land in America, more farming land, than actual farmers do at this point. I think Bill Gates is like, the second or third biggest landowner in America now? Yeah, that's kind of weird that the tech nerd, the tech guy, is now one of the biggest owners of farming land in America. Why? Because it's under capitalism, right? You can just buy up all the stuff that you want. And the idea in distributism is that the individual people would all own their own little individual section of land, 5 acres or whatever, and they could even, have a garden, start a farm on it or whatever. They wouldn't necessarily have to make all their own food themselves, but at least they have a little more independence when it comes to how they make their own way in life. And that's something to really think about, is that in America, I think there was some statistic like most Americans used to have either a garden or they grew their own food, and then somewhere up around the 1950s or so, and we really started pushing the young kids to go get college degrees and go work in corporations, that all just completely fell out the window. Pretty much nobody has their own garden anymore, or very few people do. Or at least they're nowhere near the sizes of the gardens that people used to have, where they could actually, really have some great food year round. Now, maybe they'll have like some tomatoes or strawberries, but it's still nowhere near the amount that it used to be. And something else that you'll kind of notice in our modern society is that people are very dependent on the corporations and their jobs. So they really just don't have any independence or autonomy whatsoever. If their job fires them, they're toast. That's basically it. And what this has produced is many people who are absolutely terrified of losing their jobs, even if they have like a lot of wealth or something like that, or they're supposedly quote unquote doing well in life. It's all completely dependent on their jobs. And the split second that their job goes away, they lose everything. And you kind of saw this during 2020 when they were pushing the jab. And there were so many middle class people who were proud of their college degrees and their big corporate jobs, their white collar jobs and how much money they were making. And they were suddenly terrified that, if they admitted to their employer that they weren't going to take the jab, their job would be gone. They just lose it all on the spot. So it's kind of important for us all, I think, to keep in mind that, capitalism, while, yeah, supposedly we've quote unquote thrived under it for a little bit, it has given us a lot of consumerism. It's helped us in our consumerism. It has really been a big problem in some other ways. It's made us all very dependent on corporations, on the big businessmen who all basically control us. And we really need to move back to the kind of distributist way of doing things where we can in small ways, where, maybe we make a little bit of money ourselves. Maybe we have our own 3 or 4 acres or something like that, and we grow some of our own food on it, so we're not forced to eat the pesticide covered food from the grocery stores. I mean, it's kind of sad that even nowadays, you basically in the grocery stores, you have the choice between pesticide covered food, genetically altered food, and the flat out processed food. There's almost no healthy options left over, and that's because we don't produce any of the things autonomously individually ourselves. We just rely on the big corporations that grow it all at once and ship it off to us. And the same goes for even the chickens that we get at places like Costco and whatnot. I mean, how many times have you heard about the chickens basically being artificially grown or something like that and pumped full of chemicals so that they're basically unhealthy for you, even though chicken is supposedly a quote unquote healthy food. Why is that? Because 1 or 2 big corporations grow them all for us, they ship them off to the stores for us, and that's what we pick from. We don't have a wide range of nearby local farmers we can pick from anymore because we all live in the suburbs. And speaking of which, living in the suburbs are basically designed in a certain sense, one, to eat up all the good farmland and whatnot that's available, and they're designed basically to make you hopelessly dependent on the system, if you want to put it that way. If you live in a suburb, you're not really allowed to do anything without the HOA's permission. You're not allowed to build your own structures. You can't put your own big enormous garden in the backyard or whatever. So you're basically just hopelessly dependent on whatever the HOA does or doesn't allow you to do. And it's really only useful if you're going to go work for some big corporation. And again, why would you want to do that? And to talk about that a little bit more, in America and many other places, all of the good flat farming areas that you could really use to build good farms on, they're all getting swooped on by, again, the capitalist business owners, the real estate developers, and they're all buying those places up, and they're throwing either data centers or big suburbs on them. And the suburbs are incredibly inefficient. If you look at the European cities, their houses are always very neatly designed, at least the older cities. They're always very neatly designed. They're close together to maximize space. Whereas the American suburbs just sprawl out for just miles and miles and miles, and they eat up all the good land that's available. It's really quite sad. I know it sounds like I'm just hitting on capitalism and not communism. Communism is pretty bad too. We're beginning to see that even with over-regulation and whatnot. And all the over-regulation, it's not actually hurting the big businesses, it's just hurting the small businesses. And it's quite frankly, it's by design. Because the big businesses know that if they can continue to rail against, we care about blah, blah, blah in the workplace, and they'll just keep passing all the laws. The same laws supposedly stop the big businesses really are just going to stop the new small local businesses from being formed. And we even saw this during 2020. The government and the big businesses were all in it together. The idea that the communists are going to be able to stop big businesses using the government didn't work at all. Remember, places like Walmart would be allowed to remain open, and then all the small little local businesses would be shut down. I don't know if you remember that, but that was done by design. It was to force the small individual business owners with their own autonomy out of business and to keep the big corporations like Walmart running. And I am no sort of expert on this subject matter at all. That's just what I've discovered through researching distributism so far, and I'm going to have to continue researching it some more.